First, I'd like to welcome you back. This is our fourth and final session. It will require, I believe, some degree of mental plasticity as we're spanning quite an arc of content. And we're going to begin with our good friend, Barry Curzon, who is a monk, a longtime friend of His Holiness the Dalai Lama's. He's a doctor, and he's also a Buddhist teacher who frequently teaches here in Japan. So Barry's going to be addressing emotional plasticity and subtle minds.
Your Holiness, it's a great honor to be sitting here next to you. I feel tremendous gratitude to you and also to the people from the Kokoro Research Center, as well as the Mind and Life family. It's with great joy that I'm able to join this momentous event here in Kyoto, Japan. I will be talking about emotional plasticity and subtle minds. Now, the subtle minds was added in. It wasn't part of the original idea. But we've been talking about subtle minds a little bit. His Holiness has mentioned them several times, and the topic has come up, particularly in Dr. Shin's talk about this water level between explicit and implicit mind or consciousness. So I will address a little bit to the subtle minds. So the nature of our existence is often, as the Buddha said, dukkha. This is similar but not the same to what Japanese call mendokusai.
Okay.
Mendokusai is kind of a giving up. It's an apathy. It's feeling powerless. It's withdrawing from relationships. And of course, it leads to depression. And the Buddha, in kind of talking about all this underlying angst and dissatisfaction, called this dukkha. So this is maybe a little overdone with this particular picture, but I think many of us can relate to this at different points in our lives. Now, emotional plasticity, what I'm going to discuss, Your Holiness, is basically from the Abhidharma perspective. But I'm going to give some other perspectives from Buddhist philosophy and psychology in discussing how the mind works, how it functions, how we can see it. So the first kind of metaphor I'd like to use is a mala, a rosary. This is a string with beads. And so this is actually going to be our first metaphor for mind. And what the beads represent are each moment of mind, and the string unifies. So the string then becomes a continuum of mind. Each of us has our own mental continuum. And since the mental events come about through a previous cause, and the cause must be mind itself, the main cause, not the secondary causes. Therefore, there's no beginning to this continuum. And there's a bit of controversy, but probably there's no end to this continuum, even after we attain Buddhahood or omniscience. Still, there's momentary change, but most likely each moment is the same, that is, the omniscient mind of a Buddha. So I hope this represents impermanence in Japanese. I didn't get a time to check it fully, but I believe it does. And I'm getting some thumbs up signals from the audience, so I think it's okay.
The
audience, Your Holiness,
yes.
The Japanese people. So this notion, this metaphor for mind,
right word. I don't know.
The metaphor for mind being beads on a string, then, first it begins to deconstruct the notion we often have of mind or consciousness as it being one thing that's not changing. So already we know it's changing. Secondly, each of these beads is going to be a very complex cluster of different aspects of experience. So each bead itself will not be one thing. So again, trying to desolidify our notion of mind. Now please understand that when I talk about mind, I'm talking about several words that are, in English, they're synonymous, same meaning. Mind, consciousness, head, heart, intellect, feeling, and in Japanese, ishiki, kokoro. All of these are included in when I talk about mind or consciousness today. David Bohm talked about reality, and more here is a physical reality on a very subtle level, but nevertheless physical reality as nothing more than events and processes. So this again begins to deconstruct the notion of reality as something that has an independent kind of existence separate from the observer's mind. And so this notion can also be applied to mind itself. And another way to express this is pratitya samutpad, which is dependent origination, which is the central focus of Buddhism, and is the flip side, same meaning, but little different expression of emptiness, the Buddhist shunyata. Now, mind, we can see, is divided up into basically two categories based on the Abhidharma schema from about 2,000 years ago, from Vasubandhu, Asanga, and others. And on the one side, we have this awareness, okay? Sometimes we call this primary minds. There are 6 of them. On the other side, we have kind of helpers that bring out the qualities of this awareness. And sometimes those are called mental factors. And some of the systems talk about 51 of these. Other systems in the Theravadan traditions are talking about, I believe, in the 70s. And I know His Holiness has had wonderful discussions with Paul Ekman to try to flush out maybe some further distinctions and further mental factors / attitudes / emotions / moods. Now, these 6 primary minds awareness, the first 5 of them have to do with our senses. They're not our senses, but they're connected. They're actually mind or consciousness, but they're associated with the sense. So we have the visual mind, auditory, etc. These minds are actually directly perceiving reality. Okay? They're not conceptual. They happen in ordinary people for a very tiny fraction of a second before we start thinking. So these are direct perception, no language or thought intermediary between the mind and the object. So they're direct. The last one is what we call mental consciousness, and I'd like to say a few things about that, and then I'd like to dive in, if you will, we'll open a door into subtle minds and talk a little bit about that, and then I'll come back to this schema and finish. And hopefully I can do that in the next about 8 or 9 minutes. So the mental consciousness, as His Holiness has mentioned, has different levels. Probably there's an infinite number of levels, or at least very many, but we kind of categorize them into 3. Gross, which is the thinking mind, and then subtle, some of which is conceptual, some of which is non-conceptual. So some has thinking, some has no thinking, and probably some in between, minimal or less thinking. And these involve minds such as the dream mind, which His Holiness talked about, where the senses are no longer operational, but we can still have, maybe it's kind of like memory or something. We can have visual and auditory and other sensory input in the dream, but it's not through the senses. They're quiet during dream. And then more subtle is the deep sleep state, where we're not thinking, it's non-conceptual. And then if we go even deeper than that, we get into this last category of most subtle. Now, these are very interesting because to access these and to kind of change that water point that Shin was talking about, that Shin Jojo Sensei was talking about, between explicit and implicit, sort of under the water of that iceberg you talked about of consciousness, we're now kind of trying to look at how we can actually change that water level to make more of the implicit mind become explicit. We can recognize it. And this is primarily done through study initially, but primarily then done through meditation. Now, the most subtle minds are non-conceptual and also non-dual. Non-dual in the sense that there's no awareness of a subject or an object. We just are that experience. Now, these occur naturally at the time of death, these most subtle minds. And we often talk about 8 of them, sometimes 4 or maybe 8. I'm going to present 8. And what they are is as we go through the dying process, first the physical body starts to lose its power. You know, the solid parts, the liquid parts, etc., the heat, etc. And then the minds start to become less and less, more and more subtle. Okay? Until we get to the most subtle mind called luminosity or clear light in Tibetan Wuser. And this is the subtlest mind. And so what I'd like to do for you now is to go through a few slides that show a rough approximation of what the dying person would be experiencing as he or she is dying. Now, please know a couple things. One, as this process unfolds, most of us don't have much recognition. We haven't trained. But there are some people, yogis, yoginis, who train much of their life meditating on these deeper levels of subtle and most subtle minds. So what they do during the death process is they meditate on these minds sequentially, bringing in the Buddhist wisdom. And then they actually, have the experience of seeing, if you will, I use that in parentheses, experiencing these kind of internal experiences or visions as they're actually happening during the death process. Now, the way we can induce this during life through meditation is to also work on the complementary subtle body. And here, this refers to the channels, chakras, and the energies that run within. And so, as we can begin to be pliable with the energies so that we can allow the energies to come into the central channel, which normally they're blocked, thereby allowing these most subtle minds to occur naturally. They'll just arise naturally as these energies centralize. So let's go through, and I just want to show you some rough approximations of the internal experience of these 8 stages. The first one is mirage-like. So you can see here a picture of a mirage. And again, it's not that we're looking at a mirage, it's as if we are that mirage. Second is billowing smoke. Billowing smoke coming out of a smokestack, or this picture happens to be from a fire, smoke from a fire, but just moving, dynamic smoke that is often described as billowing, coming up. And then third is fireflies in a dark night, darting around, or sometimes described as sparks, like embers coming off of a log that's already burnt in night where it's dark, and the wind comes up and blows the sparks or embers. And then thirdly is the flame. And actually it's a flame that's about to go out, so it's just a little bit flickering. And then the fifth one is like moonlight. Again, we're not looking at moonlight. It's as if we are that moonlight. And these are very difficult to describe using language because they're both non-conceptual and non-dual mental states. Hence, I say a rough, very rough approximation. And then like a sunset. Okay, we are like the sunset. These are incredibly subtle minds getting very close to the most subtle mind. And then complete blackness. Complete blackness. And then last is what we call wuser, or luminosity or clear light. It's an incredible clarity. At least this is the way it's taught or written. Of course, I have no experience. So I've kind of given a crystal to sort of give a little notion of clarity, extreme clarity. And His Holiness yesterday used the word also kind of like a reflection, not an actual reflection, but sort of the experience of reflectionness, if you will. So these are the most subtle minds that occur at the time of death, that also occur during meditation with very advanced meditators who are bringing the energies centrally into the central channel. And if the meditator is able to combine this meditation at the time of her or his death with the actual death process, then we can that person can suspend or sustain that most clear light mind, the most subtle mind of clear light. And that's what we talked about briefly as tuktam, which sometimes is roughly translated as posthumous meditation, after death. Actually, it's not after death from a Buddhist perspective, but from a modern clinical medicine perspective, it's after death. And sometimes, as His Holiness mentioned, this can be 2 weeks, like his tutor, I believe, Ling Rinpoche, kept Ling Rinpoche about 2 weeks. And one of the previous abbots of Lhasa Ling Monastery, Tisu Rinpoche. Gandatripa, yes, the head of the Galupa tradition. When he passed, he stayed, I believe, 21 days in this state. Now let's return to the more Abhidharma look, and let's look at these 51 mental factors. We won't go into much detail. I just want you to know there are Dr. Jimpa mentioned that there were 5 categories. I've listed 6. So 2 of them are afflictive. If you combine them, you get 5. So there's no contradiction here. Always present. These are always, moment to moment, they're always there with the primary awareness. And they involve intention, as Dr. Jimpa said so beautifully, just moving the mind towards an object. And then attention, kind of paying attention. And then recognizing the object. And then the mind, more than recognizing, it really contacts the object. And as a result of this contact between the mind and the object, feeling arises. Pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. Then we have determining, which are also engaging the object. And these are very much related to meditation. So what's in this category are things like mindfulness, concentration, and wisdom. And then we have the class of wholesome mental factors, so non-attachment, patience, no harm, etc. And then we have the afflictive categories, those that rob us of our peace, so attachment, harmful intention, jealousy, things like this. In that list also is mental wandering. And then lastly are the changeable ones. Examples are sleep and regret. And changeable means that depending on the motivation, they can be positive, negative, or neutral. So often sleep would be neutral, but let's say we have a dream and we're harming in the dream, then maybe that would turn into a negative or a harmful mental factor. So I don't want to spend time with this. These are all the 51, and I think we don't have time to go into detail. I've mentioned some examples from each group. So just to run through this very quickly. And then what I'd like to do is this. I'll give you an example, and I'm nearly finished. The example is a woman taking a hike. And maybe she's in Hokkaido or some beautiful place in Japan, and she encounters a waterfall. So the first thing that she does is she looks in awe, like a child, at that waterfall. All she's doing is looking. So what's happening here is the visual awareness. It's direct perception. There's no thinking. It happens for most ordinary people for a very short fraction of a second. Now, along with that come these secondary mental factors, these mental factors. So the always changing, the always present are always going to be pink here. I'm going to give 3 mind moments, if you will, moments of mind. The other ones will be present or absent, depending on the situation. Then she starts to hear the crashing of the water, of the waterfall. So then we have a different primary awareness or primary mind. This is the hearing or auditory awareness. And it has, again, the associated mental factors, which will be different than the previous moment of mind. So you can see now beads on a chain. And then she starts to think, oh, what a beautiful waterfall. I'm so lucky to have come here. And then she thinks, where's my camera? So this is the mental awareness, the thinking mind at the gross level of mental awareness, and all of its associated mental factors, which will be different from the previous moment, except these, the always present, those will always be present with each moment of mind. I want to throw one last thing in. I think I'm just about out of time, maybe 1 minute left. And that is, I want to look at mind from a different perspective now, briefly. When meditators meditate on the mind itself, a kind of shineya, shamatha meditation, a single-pointed meditation on the mind itself, what they try to identify are the essential qualities of the mind, and then try to meditate on that. And what the essential qualities are, number 1, awareness, and number 2 is clarity. Okay? So these are not easy to find. You can't read about it in a book. You have to go inside again and again, and slowly you can make contact with these qualities of awareness itself. Not awareness of something, but awareness itself. And similarly for clarity. And then you can meditate on those qualities when you meditate on the mind. And so, for example, some of the 3 meditations that Richie Davidson, Dr. Davidson's group had done with the long-term meditators is to have them meditate on 3 different types of meditation, 2 of which were nature of the mind. One involved compassion along with nature of the mind, or with the nature of the mind. But 2 of those 3 were this kind of meditation on the nature of the mind itself. Thank you very much, Your Holiness. Thank you.
Thank you, Barry.
Dualistic such. Ninang such.
No.
The other is non-dual such. Quality. Because Nisu never said, the Nisu never said, quality, Kasuri. Churching, other theatre, Nina never said, Zozo, this city, use the Eugene, Shing Kral, Eugene Nisu now, Mabche. Eugene, Mabel, Mabche. Eugene, Yabati, Lo Shenshik, Shevado, Lo Krangi. Usually, you should have young said website. The quadrant, each had to do.
His Holiness was saying that with the word,
the audience,
now, with the English word non-duality or non-dual that was referred to here.
You know, let the Yari. So, Nina tells us the Kazosneta, Nina Mabesutta. Any Pavanyamsha, you may say the Shazuli.
Now, because the English word non-duality that's being referred to, that's something that we need to think about, because in the text one talks about the quality of the mental state where there is no subject-object duality. It could be understood in 2 different ways. One is to really say that there is no subject-object distinction at all. But that is quite different from saying, so far as the experience of that individual is concerned, there is no sense of...
Samzabe, but Susan Nimislo, da Zibble, Zatade, Suan Mets, the Chigrons of Shah. Da, the Pavanyamsha, Nina Mets, the Eugene Jangshed is not Belmato, Nyamsha is the Yudi Chiggins Company.
So, in reference to this, actually, Jay in his presentation talked about the Yogacara standpoint, which rejects any subject-object distinction and duality, and ultimately it really collapses into subject. So there is an actual rejection of the reality of the object. So in that context, non-duality really is a sort of an objective statement of no distinction between a subject and object. But then non-duality... So there is no separate... So what is perceived as object is nothing but the projection of the mind, perceiving mind.
So essentially, same.
It's the same substance. But then the word non-duality can be understood in another sense, where you're not making an objective statement of there being no distinction between subject and object. So for example, in the Madhyamaka tradition, for example, then the non-duality is really description from the perspective of the individual meditator. So in that experience, there is no felt sense of there being a separation between an object out there and subject here.
But that does not mean no two things. So another consciousness, another mind can say, now I meditate on shunyata. So two things.
So from a third person's perspective,
third person
so the individual, the same person, could use a subsequent mental state then to identify in that moment there was an experience, but there was also an object. But in the moment itself, there is no felt sense of separation between the object and subject. So these kind of distinctions need to be kept in mind.
And
sometimes even in the Tibetan texts themselves, the two senses, two meanings of this non-duality is mixed up, not very clear.
Your Holiness, as you know, I have primarily a Madhyamaka background.
That's right. So,
but also I have a strong tradition in my meditation in the Nyingma tradition, Dzogchen tradition. So initially, after doing this more intensive Dzogchen meditation, I was making some confusion between the two approaches. And I talked to you about this some years ago, many years ago, and you advised me to keep them a little bit separate. So at the same time, not to combine those meditations. So therefore, what I mentioned earlier when I talked about non-duality was not being aware of a subject and not being aware of an object.
Right, yeah.
Not that they don't exist.
Yeah.
Very right. So I think
His Holiness is... So the distinction is really for the benefit of the audience, because we hear the word non-duality used quite often.
Thank you.
Barry, I'm curious as to what you feel is useful in terms of application of this perspective, this map, in a social context.
Yeah, that's a very good question. What we're doing in this context is looking at mind or consciousness from very different perspectives. I've kind of delved into it, so it kind of a little bit like the micro world, if you will. And other people are putting this in a cultural context, in an educational context, a social context. So from different vantage points, maybe larger, if you will, or more, narrow in that sense. So to bring this out into a social context, I think we can recognize how the mind works, and the fact that the mind is changing to moment means that it's pliable, it can change, it can transform. And therefore, we can identify points in our mind that are, harmful for ourselves and others, and we can actually work on those to make them more positive. So then that helps ourselves in a social context, in a family, a work context, school, community, society. And the more we recognize that nonviolent conflict resolution, for example, is a very wonderful approach to conflict, potential conflict for disagreement, then we can reduce, as His Holiness talks about many times, the need for tremendous aggression and war. War becomes obsolete, not one of our, things that we can turn to resolve conflicts. So I think it has tremendous applicability. One other area would be, for example, anger. If we can learn to turn inward through kind of a mindfulness practice and recognize incipient anger before we're screaming and red in the face, then when we can recognize it, we can work with it. We can recognize that the other person that seems to be provoking us, they're not happy. Why are they not happy? Well, maybe they had health problems, relationship problems, economic problems. And just by thinking this, we haven't suppressed the anger, but we've derailed it. We've turned it in to patience and even sometimes maybe even to love and compassion. Very, very useful in a more social context.
So, my last...
So generally, actually, when we talk about the relationship between individual and the society, in the end, society is also a collection of individuals together.
So when we talk about humanity, then if we really want some change at the humanity level, from where we start? United Nations? No. Or each country's government? No. The humanity means 7 billion individuals combined. So real change must start from individual level. So nowadays, because mentioned to that, Namsan society, Namsan community, individual
So the understanding of the mind as presented and the way in which it could be applied in the individual life will then have the impact at the life social.
The individual in society
So unless we take that into account, because then we feel that we can't do much unless society changes. So that's an important point.
I'd love to ask you one more question that just has to do with the categories. There's a vocabulary of mental processes that are articulated, 51 in this system, 70 in another system, and yet His Holiness and Paul Ekman were surfacing, it seems to be, other mental processes which weren't articulated in the Abhidharma texts. Are we seeing an emergent process in terms of the articulation of mental experience through science?
Again, a very wonderful question. It also may be glumpers versus splitters. Sometimes we can take things that look, multiple things, and some people will say there's 2 categories here. Other people will say there's 25. So there's that part. But I think what's most important are not the numbers of these individual attitudes or emotions or moods or ways of life or thinking, but rather when we go a little deeper into each one, and Dr. Jimpala and I were talking about this earlier, then the richness of each of those begins to unfold. We didn't really have the time to do that fully here today.
Actually, when we talk about list in the Buddhist sources, there is an explicit discussion of what type of list it is. some types of lists are understood to be exhaustive, but some types of lists are not really meant to be exhaustive. And the Abhidhamma list of mental factors are not really considered, specific lists are not really considered to be an exhaustive list.
Oh, good.
별로 샤샤나 영웅 샤샤나 안데 zanyu 주니 유시샤로 봐. 지양 영웅 제리시동 쓰였다.
So, for example, let us take two of the categories, groups in the list of Abhidhamma. There's the root mental afflictions and the 20 secondary derivative afflictions. Now, altogether you have what?
Same
26?
Abhidhamma Koshakarika. Same text.
Same text speaks of 26 mental factors that are afflicted. But then in the same tone of voice, the same text will speak of 84,000 afflictions. So because, the kind of expressions of human thought is endless.
That page that technology is
So imagine, as society changes, the cultural environment changes with new emergence of new technologies, one could also imagine emergence of new kinds of thought processes.
Yeah, well, Dr. Nagel will be addressing this.
Because vocabulary
Because we know for a fact that, we create new words. And in the language, the vocabulary keeps expanding. And along with those new nouns, names, comes concepts and thoughts that go with them.
Wonderful. Barry, thank you so much. Truly. We'll be hearing now from Junko Tanaka Matsumi, who is a professor of psychology and has spent many decades in observing behaviors in the classroom of very young children. And as we were speaking the other day, she was saying that after so many years of in vivo observation, she can read, walk into a classroom and sort of read it almost like a common text. She's become so sensitized in her capacity to observe. And she's going to be presenting Mapping the Mind of Children and Creating a Positive School Environment, Evidence-Based Practice in Psychology. So, Junko-la. Aha.
Yeah.
Maybe, yeah. Is that comfortable?
Right?
Yeah.
Comfortable?
Hear me?
Comfortable?
Yes.
It's comfortable.
Okay.
All right.
It sounds a little like there's a loose connector.
That's
Yeah,
fine. Can
I
you hear
think
me?
that
Okay.
setup is not a good one. Let's change your mic. Yeah.
Change my mic.
Yeah, change your
All right.
microphone. We're going to change your headset out. It sounds like it's...
No.
This happened to me in the last Dharam Sala meeting. I put my mic on upside down, and there was a lot of mirth on the part of our main person here.
Okay. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes?
All right, great.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Your Holiness, I deeply appreciate this very valuable opportunity to speak to you about some of my experiences working with very young children for many, many years in the United States and in Japan. And I'd like to thank the Mind and Life Institute and the Kokoro Research Center of Kyoto University for inviting me to share with everybody here in the audience what I have done. I think children are the treasures of the society, universally across cultures. And so I'd like to really describe to you in very, very specific terms what children can learn and what they can do and what we need to provide them with in terms of teaching environment. And my title more or less reflects what I'll be talking about. Mapping the mind of children, for me, includes very close observation of children in everyday life context. Children's behaviors change moment to moment, just as the mind changes every moment, as we have been learning for the past 2 days. And we need to do something in terms of action, professional action, in the very environment children live and learn and go to school. And for that, we also need evidence or data to show that what we are doing is actually producing changes in the behaviors of children and the teachers that we work with. So my outline first would be the scientist practitioner model of training. How do I train my graduate students, both in the United States and in Japan, so that they can work with children directly in the very environment they live day by day? How can we produce positive change in each individual child? And eventually, how can we actually help the child to self-manage their own behaviors, independent of our initial help? And we include in this process training of teachers, parents, and families. And eventually, my hope is that we can create educationally contemplative environment for the children that we serve. Currently, Japan has experienced tremendous changes in values, from homogeneity, everybody's the same, to diversity. We have all kinds of children in the classroom. Our classroom size is still about 40 children in some schools, and with one teacher. And even though the teachers are working very hard and they are very competent, as John said today, this morning, it's very difficult, one single teacher, to do it competently and comfortably. They are stressed. I have 2 themes here. It seems contradictory that Japan is, let's look at this one first. According to the world record, Japan ranks second in terms of performance in science application. These are the tests done every 3 years, and Japanese high school students are ranked the second.
high school.
So, top is Finland. These are out of 34 countries of the world participating in the OECD. United States is about in the middle. So just by looking, people would think that Japan's educational accomplishment is quite impressive after World War II, and the educational system is working effectively. Is that true? On record, it looks like that. However,
I pay more attention to what last Mexico.
So
Can you go back to the
Mexico.
Mexico is here. Okay.
last round? So altogether, how many countries participate?
This one is 34.
But not all 34s are on this slide.
You can count 34. There are 34
yes.
countries.
Yeah,
There are the additional 33 countries participating that I'm just presenting, just to show that in general, Japan has a very impressive academic record of accomplishment. That's not my story.
Has there been any research done on why this is the case?
It depends on the curriculum and the pressure for achievement, parental interest in education, many different things. Okay? This is not my point. My point is actually, in the classroom, there are a number of children who are not able to follow what the teacher is saying and cannot perform academically. For the first time, the Japanese government conducted a survey, and this is the second time in 10 years. This is the most recent one. According to my own thinking, conservative estimate, at least 6.5% of children in elementary and middle schools are not able to follow what the teacher is saying. And yet, because of homogeneity value, they are in the regular classroom without being able to get the individual help they need. In the United States, these children were able to access individual support, additional help. In Japan, it's very, very difficult. Also, parents do not want to isolate their children outside to the regular special education classroom. So what can we do about it? That's my theme today. Every prefecture has its own program. I work very closely with the city of Kobe, and I owe a lot to Kobe City. The Board of Education established a system where they would ask university professors and other specialists like myself to be a consultant to Kobe City. And I will train these graduate students. These are graduate students. In the schools, they are called educational assistants. They are placed in different schools, 2 or 3 at a time. Their task is to be in the classroom, observe the children, work very closely with the children as class goes on. So we are working in a very dynamically changing everyday environment of education of children. My job is to consult with the Board of Education, provide supervision to these graduate students, and the students will actually design a program and conduct research and evaluate the outcome of research at the same time. This also includes teacher training. So the model of training is, as I said, the scientist practitioner model of training graduate students in applied psychology. We value research, and we have heard a lot about basic research in the past 2 days. We apply anything we can to our practice. Research and practice are integrated into the whole education system. More, we try to do the practice in everyday school settings, right in the classroom. So it's a lot of work for students as they need to observe. The first thing we did is to see how many students actually needed individual support in each class. And as you can see, these are a number of students who needed different amounts of help, 9 or 10, certainly more than 6.5%, which would account for 2 to 3 students per class. So we needed to see what problems they have within each school. We then did direct observation of the behaviors that were not in line with the curriculum, that might interfere with classroom activities. If you can compare the red bars with blue bars, red bars represent students who needed a lot of support, and blue ones not so much. I have marked in red those particular behaviors that were prominent, such as poor posturing or incorrect response. They raise their hands, but they are not correct. Or non-compliance, not following instructions. These are very specific behaviors. Eventually, these children will... Eventually, these children will not pay attention to the academic instructions because they don't understand. They might play with whatever they have on their desk. They are very quiet, but they're not attending. They might work very slowly because they don't know how to do the problem solving. My point here is we could identify specific behaviors, and we observe these behaviors rather reliably because we had multiple observers. But the point is we can't change these behaviors without knowing the context in which these behaviors occur, under what circumstances these behaviors occur. So we adopted a method of observation, which we here call contextual monitoring or observations of children's behavior. Here is a behavior that might be out of control, like getting out of seat. You can't reduce this behavior unless you can point out under what conditions does the child leave the seat during class? And what happens? What does the teacher do when the child is out of seat? Does the teacher punish the child or say nothing to the child? Depending on the consequence, we can predict whether the behavior will increase or decrease. My point here is, for every behavior we see, we need to understand the context in which these behaviors occur. And this involves direct observation. So here, let me show you one example of a child who was quiet, who was very quiet. But when the graduate student observed the child in the classroom, this child was in first grade, quiet, but whether or not the child was on task, listening to the teacher, doing the task or not, varied tremendously over days. This is consistent with what Richie Davidson was saying, variable behavioral frequencies. Here, we try to provide additional support individually to the child by prompting the child what the teacher said. And you can see the increase in performance as a result of providing little additional help. And when we take away this support, the child is again at about 50%. In this class, the average was about 85% for other children. So here I want to just point out, children's behaviors are highly variable as a function of environment. The environment includes the teacher performance, nature of instruction, material, weather, classroom, so on. We need to identify what it is that we are talking about specifically. So the child also needs to know what the child needs to do. One simple thing we did, this is in Japanese, it says, when the bell rings, be seated in seat, so the teacher can begin class. Okay? So one thing is, set the clear expectation of the behavior, teach self-monitoring, observe your own behavior. It's very simple. Are you in seat or not? And the teacher provides praise for self-observation and feedback. And each child has this kind of card on the desk. And we will note whether the child was able to perform. Because simply telling a child to be seated is not enough. They need practice, they need feedback, and they need very specific cues to remember and see. And when we ask the child, what do you want to do most? My point here is, half the children in the Japanese schools listed academic behaviors. This means they are motivated to do well, they want to do well, but they may not be able to perform due to many, many factors. Okay? So I will skip here, but one of the things we try to do over the years is to pay attention to specifically expected behaviors for each class, teach the child to observe, record, and provide plenty of support, praise, particularly to young children. We're talking about 1st to 3rd grade most of the time. This is another example. When the bell rang, these are the numbers of students who are not seated in 1st grade. Out of 31, for one particular class, 6 students were out of seat. If you were a classroom teacher, this means you can't get your class started. We actually timed how many minutes it took the child to be seated and the teacher to begin. So these behaviors are also very highly variable. What can we do about this situation? Here you can see about class 34 through 55, children were seated with a very simple procedure of telling them what it is that they need to do, provide them with feedback. This is just one simple example, paying attention to yourself and learning that it is important for us also. Okay? I'm not talking that this is a particularly important behavior. What I'm talking is that for the child to observe himself or herself and paying attention and getting reward for what the child is doing is a very first step in learning in group orientation, in a classroom setting. Okay? This is my mostly final slide. And I just showed you these two parts here, just to see that this self-monitoring procedure is working. We took away the monitoring card. We returned to routines, and children began to get out of seat. So we learned that perhaps this particular intervention was working to produce the behavior change in this particular classroom. And therefore, we implemented this very simple procedure over days. And so this took from June to December. It's a very simple thing. And when the behavior becomes automatic, we don't have to do it every time. And most likely, this behavior will generalize to other settings. I will summarize what I think is very important. To help the child in the everyday life context, we need to observe the child in everyday environment, not in the office, not in the clinic, in the everyday environment of the child. We need to assess what the child can do now, what is or her strength. We need to develop positive behaviors in very small steps so that children do not fail. Those 6.5% of students have already developed histories of failures in Japanese schools. We need to reverse that process by giving them tasks they can manage and get reinforcement for those. Eventually, teach self-observation of their own behaviors, which I think is a beginning of self-control, and praise the child for self-observation. So my conclusion is, mapping the minds of children is really an interactive process with the environment and with the observer. Child cannot be on his or her own in isolation from the context. Secondly, behaviors are very highly variable across situations. And therefore, we need context-specific methods of observation. We've talked about calibration of the methods. We do reliability checks by training multiple observers in the same classroom. And some of the data that I've shown you today may show that research and practice are both very essential parts of the holistic training of professional psychologists or applied psychologists or other professionals working with young children. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
And this is the university that I work. It looks like California, but it actually is near Kobe.
His Holiness was asking the classroom data that you presented. What age are the children?
Mostly today's data are first grade to third grade children, age 7 to about 9 years of age. For older children, we do something else. Very young children. Our data show that young children can monitor their behaviors because we independently observe the same behavior without telling the children. We compare the data. We don't praise them for accuracy. We praise them for paying attention to their own behavior and learning to pay attention.
바이오에서는 다가 잘하지 버리지. 잘하지 버리지. 바이오 다는 또 주변에 보지 해야 되나. 주고 양보만 돼야 나 지구 동백할 때 동 kubjagal de moto wat zure de ko ngonjin chero ju an su 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 tangjin che je tabshi se lawe na pando dos andi shu kanda zhe chebe gabl de ya de ta ya da
Wonderful.
I have one question for His Holiness. My question is, what role does behavioral training play in the education of young children and mapping of their minds when you teach young Buddhists, whether they're children or adolescents? May
I have no
you-
experience. I have no experience to teach children.
Right.
He's also saying that he can only speak from his experience as a student
Yes,
in at the hands of his tutor, but he doesn't have any experience of teaching small children.
You mean the one with the whip?
Yes,
Solins was saying that if he were in that classroom that you were observing, he would be one of those spikes.
I should tell you that over the years, we no longer have these problems in the classroom. We ourselves graduate from certain school A, school B, and school C in a few years, and the teachers can continue to do what we did for them or with them. Then we move on to another school.
디 당분간에 코란주 다 조고 여러봐. 근데 가로나 다 기겐 코란 파. 니마 딱바라시 라렌 따탄 랍샤 되고라. 가로치네 네 랍르티 나로는 코란주 내가 찍고요 말했어. 기겐 저 겐케제 고 랍데 스탄기 틱팀 콘도 차제. 랍르시 다젤 라렌 따도야 고조에 기바도. So since you have experience of working in the States as well, so how does this compare with data from the States?
In terms of types of behaviors that I observed in the classroom, not very different. But in terms of availability of support, I certainly think the United States provides much more funding, much more professional support for each individual child. It might reflect what some of the things that Dr. Kitayama was saying this morning, cultural practices.
말에 자기 지구리면도 간다 지금 메게르부터 소소리아 개진부지야 돼 아래지소 노조부터 여러왔을 때 내가 돈에 지 강해연이야 믹스에기야 로체 이렇게 만도스 야 리빈 지소 나로 정말 참여명해야다.
The class size is also different, like 25 versus 40.
아니 진짜 마뉴얼에 개발요레스 아래 자셔야나 니슈장아 저런도 알아서 리빙 진짜 망절시 보고 싶죠 저러서.
Wonderful.
Junko, I'd love to ask you a question that has to do with what you're observing appears to be behaviors associated with attentional capacity.
Partly, yes.
I'm curious about the affective dimension. When you begin to measure that or how that's cultivated or if there's a relationship between the attentional domain and the affective domain. In other words, kids who are more practice restraint, which is something self-restraint, more compliant, more self-observing, is it the case that they are more generous, grateful, more caring?
To answer your question, it's difficult. We have done other projects in schools specifically focused on children who score high on self-report measures of depression. And those children who score high also score high on anxiety and interpersonal relations. We actually observed them in the classroom. We had them play games together and see how they interact with each other. We also followed them into the playgrounds. And oftentimes they were isolated, and they also do not communicate effectively. They try many, many times, but they don't get as much positive responses back.
So apropos, I guess one of the questions that's sort of in the back of my mind has to do with the culture of shut-ins. In Japan, shut-ins.
Excuse me, I didn't hear.
The culture of shut-ins.
Shut-ins, yes.
Yes, of young people who have opted out of all social relations.
It's a very significant problem. Actually, we have another project in Kobe City, consulting with agencies serving adolescents and older. We just started that project this year, and we actually train in communication at home. These people don't come out, don't want to attend these workshops, so we work with parents and families. We deal with very specific interactions between the mother and the adolescent child, so that their interactions start changing, hopefully. So it's a major problem.
I'm just wondering if there's any causal relationship, then we have to move on to the third presentation. But do you feel there's any causal relationship between the degree of compliance that's demanded in the Japanese educational system and young people opting out of society,
yes,
becoming shut-ins?
Yes. But unfortunately, they do not seem to have additional strength to be assertive or to be independent in a very culturally appropriate way. So there are problems, but they are responding. So we are quite hopeful as far as our projects are concerned.
Wonderful. Thank you so much,
Juko-san. Thank you.
So we'll be hearing from Dr. Makoto Nagao, a very interesting presentation related to robotics and artificial intelligence. This is kind of jumping in a certain way into the future, but Dr. Nagao will be exploring communication between robots and humans, which is probably going to be a significant part of our future, and how mind mapping is necessary in order to engender that kind of possibility.
It is a great honor for me to speak to His High Holiness. I am a computer scientist, and you may think computer has nothing to do with mind problem. But it's on the contrary. Computer science needs help from psychology, cognitive science, etc. So here I will discuss the mind problem from a robotics or artificial intelligence standpoint. Japan has the most long-lived population in the world. The number of aging people who need care is increasing rapidly, and the scarcity of care workers creates a serious problem. There is a strong demand for a variety of caretaking robots. At present, a robot that can manage everything like human caretaker has not been developed. Only a robot that can enact a single function has been developed. Robots must understand the needs of the patients or aged people they are to help. Conversation between individuals and robots is essential for this understanding to be achieved. Individuals' demands are usually not clear, sometimes very vague and ambiguous. So a robot must ask questions in response to humans to clarify their demands. This process will be repeated until a robot is sure of its understanding. People who need help also want to have comforting words from care workers or caretaking robots and wish to have trustworthy feeling to them. Here is an example of a dialogue that shows the need for resolution of ambiguity. In Japanese, sensei here written in Chinese characters in red, means either medical doctor or school teachers, etc. So when a person says, I don't feel well, please call me a sensei, a robot must check, do you mean a medical doctor or a school teacher? Another example is the requirement of information about the current situation. For example, person says, please clean up here. Robot will respond, do you mean this table? Person says, no, this room, I mean. Robot, okay, then how about this table also? The person will say, please don't touch it. Robot say, okay, I don't. A robot must recognize a table and a room and must understand that don't touch means don't clean up the table. Common sense is always required in a conversation. An example is when several persons sit around the dinner table and the person points at the salt shaker on the table and say, is that a salt? Robot will say yes, but with no action. This is not the answer the person expects. Instead, robot should answer, yes, do you want this? With the action to pass the salt to him. The robot must understand the meaning or the implication of the utterance. So the process for a robot to understand the dialogue is first speech recognition and the conversion to a written sentence. Second, analysis of a sentence, then inference from an analyzed sentence to reach a conclusion. Here, the knowledge is required. Then, generation of a sentence that expresses the conclusion explicitly. And finally, speech synthesis from the generated sentence. So, speech recognition, analysis of a sentence, or speech synthesis, these are almost well done at this technical level. But the most difficult stage in this process is inference involving knowledge. Knowledge is...
제발 쳐봐줘야 되는 강한 도스. 당하다 직 센텐스 동거시야. 다들이 용 두고 로봇 돈.
Knowledge is required for dialogue. Here, knowledge includes dictionary, encyclopedia, common sense, daily news, information about the current situation or personal data, and so on. Inference process is based on this knowledge. Research and development of each process stage is fairly well advanced now, but the total system has not yet been realized because the inference direction is greatly influenced by the mental state or mental factors such as compassion, high or low emotion, or friendly or unfriendly attitude, and so on. So it's very, very complicated. Now, here is an example of computers using knowledge and inference. The computer software, Watson, was developed to challenge a quiz program, Jeopardy, in the United States TV program. It was elaborated for more than 5 years with many researchers at IBM. The software defeated the Jeopardy champion in 2011. It accumulated knowledge and information equivalent to 1 million books. Powerful inference was made using a supercomputer. This experience will be applied to question answering in medical and nursing services in the near future, the IBM declared. But
was
the
the
inference
difference.
process,
무슨 또 제제 컴퓨터 톱에서 그 저만 보시고 지금 렌즈하고 뜨고 되는 컴퓨터 그대 사이즈지 콜론제 제도고 그 나로 주제 근데 제바 저바지 되고 나르게 영화다 시가 시에버디 배주제 그 잠종을 하는 저바지고 되고 지금 그 시야 망하는 제바 망하는 뒤쪽에 never check
but the inference process here is purely logical and has no involvement of mental factors. Therefore, big improvement will be required for the medical and the nursing services.
일단은 내가 다른 디가 로직을 단자지마도 이네 미규모 쪽에 저바 제베가리아 갑다 dü인제 반항고 롱랑도 라면도 아니야 내가 요다면 막 보여지기 고유지기 나로려야 아니 렌자 봐도 되어 지기 어려웠다 컴퓨터가 디자인에 단다 제도고요 말했어.
So it is not enough to give back an answer very.
So a computer, I mean, it's really the robot's ability to respond is really limited to what has been inputted.
Yeah, computer respond very, very mechanically, and no sophistication like human mind. That's a problem.
So, for example, if there is a term that has not been put in, then the computer, if there is a word that has not been inputted into the computer system, the computer simply wouldn't know what it is.
Well, computer understands somewhat of the human words, of course, but when the sentence structure is complicated, the computer cannot understand, and particularly the human utterance has kind of mental states expressed in the sentence utterance, but computer cannot understand. Computer cannot realize that kind of thing. So it's a problem. So it is not enough to give back an answer very mechanically. An example is, a person says, "I'm thirsty." A robot passes a glass of water without saying anything. That's not enough. It is necessary to convey.
So, for example, like you have a robot caretaker and you ask for a water, and if the water happened to have a fly in it, what would the what would the robot do?
Well,
and so, what about if the person says, "There's a fly in this. Why aren't you taking it out?" So, how would the robot respond?
Robot probably has a very precise eye camera, and will find out some irregularity in the water. And sorry to
the camera me too chogruas. The robot robot milia camera na jisuje. The antinan tamara the yume chabache to egg. The on two meters.
So the robot must apologize for that.
But what about if you complain that the water doesn't smell right?
Well, nowadays there are a number of researches about smelling, and
so in that case, we will have to not only give the robots eyes, but also noses and ears and everything.
Yeah, 5 senses.
Yes.
That should be equipped to the robot in the future. Okay, when the person says, "I'm thirsty," a robot passes a glass of water without saying anything. That is not good. That is not good. It is necessary to convey messages with emotional warmth, which gives spiritual healing to a listener. So, to the human utterance, "I'm thirsty," robot will respond, "You are. Yes, the air has become dried up. Do you want a glass of water or a cup of tea?" Then person says, "Tea, please." And then robot will add as the words, "How about another cup of tea," etc. With this kind of a sympathetic dialogue, a person will be satisfied and will put trust in the robot. One's mental state is revealed by one's utterance. It will be expressed through accent, intonation, honorifics, polite vowels, adverbs, sentence-ending expressions in Japanese, etc. There are different expressions for the same demand, such as go away or go there, could you go there, or may I ask you to go there, etc. The expression is influenced by the environment and is context-dependent and also culture-dependent, of course. All these expressions involve and also imply emotions. Humans can easily discriminate the sophistication in these variations and recognize a deeper meaning in the utterance. But the interpretation is always influenced by the environment and context and culture, and also by the human mental state. So, we have a question: can we create a computer dialogue system that can interpret the state of someone's mind from an utterance? To create a very good dialogue system, we have to construct a kind of simulation system that realizes the function of the human brain. Until the function of the human brain is clarified, we have to construct a dialogue system that functions similarly to the human mind by extracting a variety of factors from human conversations, some of which I referred in the previous slides. We, the computer scientists, need the help of psychologists, cognitive scientists, and others for the model building of the mind function. For example, he mentioned about there are 51 or 70 factors of the mental state. Probably they will give us good suggestions in model building. Now, the Turing test is famous in computer science. It was proposed by Alan Turing in 1950. It is a test of a machine's ability to exhibit intelligent behavior equivalent to or indistinguishable from that of a human. When a person has a conversation with both human and a machine, and when he or she cannot distinguish which one is a human, then we can conclude the machine is intelligent enough. The machine may not be intelligent in a strict sense, but behaves like an intelligent human. If we can construct a software system that passes the Turing test, one can say that we have constructed the human mind functionality in this software system. There are at least 3 approaches to understand the human mind. Through academia, philosophy, psychology, cognitive science, brain science, etc., and through contemplative practice, religious meditation, Buddhism or Zen. From a functional standpoint, through a computer dialogue system, I think. By the way, in an applied sense, there is a high demand for robots that can understand and serve individual needs in hospitals, etc. So demand for such robots will create a large industry in the future. So, if we can construct a computer dialogue system that can pass the Turing test, its internal software mechanism will be a kind of answer to the question, what is a human mind? It is an indirect way of mapping the mind, I think. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Nagao.
Thank you. I don't know when we can realize this kind of thing in in robotics world, but probably in another 10 years we'll be able to construct such conversation system in restricted domains, such as hospitals or some consultations for some specific purposes and so on.
My last visit Japan, on demonstrations, robot, some machine, some movement. You see,
Stepping up, on the steps and staircase, and walking down and climbing up and down. All of this seems to be done well. The motion.
저 모tor 그제 열사. 모tor 쉽주잖아. 쉽주잖아.
So His Holiness was informed that some of these robots have about 40 to 50 different motor systems.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
So now this kind of robot, 지금 machine 그זה
So, has there been a robot
because
like
movement something. Then the million book information capture. Did the condition computer.
You mentioned this Jeopardy test that there was a machine, a computer that has a memory of about 1 million books.
Yeah.
Is that a robot?
yes, a kind of robot. I
was
can
kind
say.
of robot.
I can say.
So,
But the inference in that case is purely logical, mechanical. The process is not based on the kind of human heart.
yes. So His Holiness's question is that in the robots that are moving around, clearly you need motor systems to allow those mobility.
Technology. That's
Technology. But for the kind of artificial intelligence type robots that you're talking about that would respond cognitively to some of these dialogue situations, what kind of machines would be needed? Is it just a computing power?
Well, not only the computing power, but also the we have to have a good modeling of human mind actions, functions. And for Jeopardy of IBM, always gives the same answer. It's mechanical and static. But in human case or robotics case, the environment will change. And so always the answer comes in different ways. Because the knowledge and situations are different.
So His Holiness's question is, so for the motor, you need different motor systems to build in the robot. So for this kind of artificial intelligence work, what kind of physical things do you need in the robot to allow this, to facilitate this?
Well, that depends on the circumstances or the purpose for use. For example, for extinguishing the fire, then robots should be designed in a specific ways. And for the radiation, nuclear power radiation, then it's different.
Nuclear radiation usually tango robot zena ko chawa chatawa chila mix ek tone ya ko
그것도 루시.
de chegures.
But they
Koyu
don't,
tyunje pa kurang chajo yuwa tang tunye ji tang de ji ku gores la.
but in all cases of the nowadays robot, they don't have any such warm-hearted function. That is a problem. So when a robot is used for mechanical environment, that's okay. But when
로봇 수 참지적 맞지 룸딩 맞다야.
Solens was saying that, of course, a robot won't show you an affection, but at the same time, a robot will never be angry towards you.
That's good. So robot will never be troublemaker. So very good, useful. and no need payment because you see, no need food or sleep or bed. So just buy the robot and keep there at least several years.
When a
So
robot,
save your money. And don't look at any trouble. Daily routine, you see, the robot can carry.
Can
but
do.
when a robot is to be used for human help, then robot must understand the human mind. That is the essential point, I think.
그래서 이제 발로
다른 미술 로봇이야다 네버도 로봇이 제도 믹스해서 로봇도 요 말에서 다들 서버라 지투두게 미나신지기 때서 피네주게 쉐벤들 랭잡다한다 지 소유의 넘버를 떼고 요레스 다들 강해도스
더 당근에 리미테이션 열상단 야가요다.
So Solon was saying that maybe it's probably better to recognize the limitations of robotics right at the beginning as you design these
다음에
things.
시험시험으로 살려면 죽은데 디스마인이 그래.
Yeah, because if you expect that it will be able to do everything, then there will be disappointment.
Oh, wonderful. Technology is really wonderful. Really wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Really miracle. Roya. That's a miracle.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.